Hello and welcome to another edition of The Copper Show. I'm very glad to say I've got Hayden Locke, the CEO of Marimaca, with me today again, and we're going to be talking all things copper. Hayden, how are you?
Very well, thanks, Merlin. Good to be back.
Good to be back. The summer holidays are with us, and you're home alone with the kids. Well, not home alone, but with the kids. Is that proving to be good for your working day, or does it kind of change the pattern a bit?
Yeah, somewhat interrupted working day, and I imagine there'll probably be a couple of them come in during this chat.
Good. Well, today what I'd like to just talk about is timelines and kind of progress in the copper industry. I've been really struck by what Robert Friedland and Ivanhoe and Kamoa-Kakula is doing as a production base. You know, they produced, I think, 104,000 tons of copper this quarter. It's just a powerhouse production asset, and that discovery was only made in 2008 by mates of mine, actually, kind of Ross and Tom. But they reached commercial production in 2022, which is going some. You know, that's quite quick, but that's 14 years. Have you had a look at Kamoa-Kakula? Do you know much about that project, or any comments on that timeline?
Yeah, it's a remarkable timeline. I think I think everybody who's looked at that timeline, who's in the industry, is blown away by how quickly they did it. But it is classic Robert Friedland. When he sets his mind to something, he has a remarkable ability of circling the wagons and pushing everyone in the right direction and raising the money required to make that move. So it is an incredible asset. I think the production numbers coming out of it and the teams, there's ability to exceed the nameplate capacity of the mills has been pretty incredible, and they're expanding, and it's going to be an amazing source of copper for the foreseeable future. It
wasn't an overnight success, though, in a sense that the discovery was made in 2008, but Ivanhoe Mining's been in the Congo for decades. I mean, he was funding exploration for an awfully long time before that. I mean, it was the product of a lot of application of focus and money.
Yeah, that's right. People ask all the time. I think Friedland's been associated with several of the most significant discoveries across many commodities. People ask how on earth he manages to do that. Well, the answer is he's investing a lot of money through the cycle, significantly more than the major mining companies were for a long period of time. And so, people see the success and think it's just gotten lucky. But the reality is he spent a lot of time and a lot of money and continue to invest when nobody else would.
And in a sense, he was also very lucky that Kamoa-Kakula is in the kind of the western foreland of the kind of the Congo. It's open savanna. It's been the forests have been denuded. There's not a big population there. There's not a kind of a specific environmental kind of acute point. It's not the middle of a game reserve. Let's put it that way. And so the kind of the development timelines were they're incredibly quick because there were fewer obstacles. It's not often that you come across a development asset where all the doors can open very quickly. It's like when you're driving out of London, you get all the green lights. It feels great, but it doesn't happen very often.
Yeah, the legislative environment is really extending those timelines and making it not impossible to get mines into production, but certainly extending those timelines with the additional work that is required to make sure that mines are being developed sustainably and can deliver benefits in the future.
There's I'm sure you've seen the work of Richard Shodder, the guy from Minex Consulting in Australia. He's done quite a few studies showing that the timelines are actually increasing from discovery, and I think the average time length for copper project is now 17 years. But it feels to me that the bigger the project, the slower it is, the longer the timeline. But again, very specific to the geography that you're talking about. I mean, these. Actually, you know what? Let's come on to the. I will come on to the specifics of what it takes to get a big project into production. But I just want to kind of give a shout out first of all to the exploration discoveries in the Andes by the Lundin Group. With Philo and NGX. I'd love to get your opinion on what they've been doing this last in recent months.
Yeah, well, again, another group that is remarkable for its track record of success and That whole region, the Vicuña region, is generating an enormous amount of excitement. It is in the relatively early stages. So as we talk about timelines to first production, it's in relatively early stages. But it's now looking like it's a string of several of the most incredible new discoveries probably in the last 20 years in this part of the world. So I think we watch it with a great deal of interest. It's obviously captured the imagination of some of the majors with BHP making an investment there. And I think it's going to become a quite significant potential future source of all of these fundamental commodities. Whether or not that happens while I'm still working will remain to be seen, but I've got no doubt we're witnessing some of the most amazing new discoveries that you're likely to see.
I feel very cautious about talking kind of in any bad terms about the work they're doing, because it's so fantastic. But I think we do have to acknowledge that it's high and it's on the boundary of two countries, and they've got complex issues to deal with, including water and environmental issues. I mean, in terms of timelines, have you got kind of how do they cope with things like that?
Yeah, it's very challenging. I think it just adds a layer of complexity that will really extend those timelines. If there was a group to be moving those projects forward, I would say it's in the best hands that it could possibly be in, given their track record in the Latin American copper or general commodity space. So it's definitely in the right hands. How do you go about it? With a great deal of elbow grease and a lot of time and a lot of money and, a lot of changes of strategy as you find blockages and dead ends. And, you have to be pretty fluid in your strategy and are able to change relatively quickly and make decisions very quickly. And that's why I think, if any group can move it quickly and deliver it in a meaningful timeline, it will be that group, because of their ability to be agile and make good decisions.
Chile, there's been a lot of kind of confusion, and there's been lots of mixed messages about the environmental legislation. Some developments have been rebuffed. There's been changes in the Congress. You're developing in Chile. Can you give me your take on Chile as a mining jurisdiction in terms of timelines and permitting and what it means?
There's been a lot of noise and a lot of press, and it seems that the press only ever reports one negative slant on what is actually occurring. And so what we've seen is a very rational response to quite aggressive attempts to, I won't say hijack, but change the legislation to be much more anti-mining. I think that's been pretty clear, and that has been rebuffed. The mining sector is incredibly important to Chile, like it is in Australia. It's an incredibly important part of the economy. And
sorry, who was trying to change the mining legislation? So, just provide a bit of context, please.
Yeah, during the rewrite of the Constitution, which obviously got voted down last year, there was a small group of sort of hard left political activists that were trying to implement much more, I think, stringent controls, which I don't think the mining industry is against, but some of them were completely ridiculous and would never have been able to be achieved. So there needs to be a balance of, yes, we want to protect, but along with this realistic and rational and able to be implemented. That was voted down. A lot of those changes were voted down aggressively by the public referendum that occurred on the Constitution. The new Constitutional Assembly has been formed, and it is a very different makeup. And that's, I think, reflective of the view of the Chilean people that we want change. It's got to be reasonable. And so, they've spoken with their votes where it counts. So I think we'll see a little bit more moderation, but I think the general trend in the mining industry is towards more regulation around this very important issue. And so we've just got to be prepared that this is going to occur for all mines, and it will add time. It doesn't necessarily mean the mines won't get into production. It just means there will be additional time, additional work, and additional cost to get to that final first production milestone.
So in some ways, it's not different from many places around the world in the sense that legislation is increasing, environmental regulations are kind of more stringent, and you've got to demonstrate that you're taking this responsibility and doing things according to the law that prevails.
Absolutely. There is no jurisdiction for mining in the world, despite what people can tell you, that does not have an increased burden and an increased requirement focused on sustainable development of mining projects. I think there is a growing recognition as the mining industry spends a little bit more time and money educating people on how important it is, that we need it, so we can't not have it. So if you want us to help solve these problems that we've identified in the world, we need support to develop these assets more sustainably. We need to be reasonable in terms of the regulations that we require of the mining industries, and I think it's happening the world over. It doesn't matter if it's in the middle of Africa with a nascent mining industry or in Australia, the US, Canada with a very mature mining industry. We're seeing increased focus on sustainable development across the board.
Does that mean you think the timelines, the 17-year timeline is likely to actually be slower, and is the bigger the project, the slower it's likely to be? Is it much easier to get a small thing into production quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. I think scale is always something that is a big driver of your ability to get into production quickly. Certainly on the permitting side, but also on the technical side, it's just a much bigger project to understand and identify and address all the risks that come with these projects. The scale of the project is very important for that. I think there will, so yes, absolutely. On average, the timelines are going to increase, especially as projects are becoming, in more difficult locations than they've ever been before. I think, though, that there will still be nuances within a single jurisdiction. And I talk about this a lot with both you and Matt, that, if you just say Chile is good or Chile is bad, that fails to take into account the nuance of the various areas within Chile. So there is a big difference between permitting a mine in the Antofagasta region of Chile, which is its whole economy basically is mining, versus getting something approved in southern Chile, right down near Patagonia. That's going to be a very different permitting environment. The same in Australia. If you're permitting something in the Hunter Valley in New South Wales next to some billionaire horse stud, it's going to be very different to getting something permitted in out in the goldfields in Western Australia. It's just a nuance within the geographies. And so there will be some groups that can permit very quickly. And I go back to this, location is very, very important in your ability to get from where you are today, an idea, a concept, into production in a reasonable timeline. Location is one of the key things that I think as an investor we should be looking at. Which is
kind of riffs back to the Kamoa-Kakula situation in the western foreland of the DRC. It was a very good location for it to be a mine, because there were no tourist hotspots, there were no millionaires' mansions and vineyards. And coming back to Chile, so when I speak to people, some of the local geologists, they say that the high Andes with the kind of ecological sensitivity and the tourist areas further south, those are kind of the places which kind of raise flags in terms of timelines for them. And they say that the kind of the coastal belt, the lower population density, the less kind of sensitive. I mean, everywhere is ecologically sensitive, but there are degrees. They say that those are the areas where you can get your permits done more quickly.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. There's nuances, but absolutely, I think in the high Andes, there are glaciers feeding fresh water into rivers that need to be managed. I think there is added complexity, and then obviously you get into how do you build the infrastructure to get up there? You have much longer infrastructure timelines to build out that infrastructure in much larger areas to potentially impact. Yes, absolutely. It adds more complexity and will certainly add some time to the ability to get into production.
And then coming back to a smaller project is easier to build than a bigger project. You only ever build a smaller project when you've got the grade and the economics to have kind of financial critical mass. So you need the grade and the metallurgy to work well for you to be able to start small, so that you can then kind of incrementally develop a larger project down the line. But a lot of the big porphyries are very low grade, which is why they have to start so big, which is perhaps a challenge in terms of timelines and getting going.
Yeah, and I think also, the economics on a bigger project with those economies of scale will always tend to look better on paper. And of course, it makes sense for a big company that has the balance sheet and doesn't have the funding constraints to go for an optimized, right-sized project, which tends to be much larger with those very, very large projects. I think that comes with numerous challenges. Permitting is one of them. Permitting a very large-scale mine is challenging just because of the amount of material moved and the amount of waste generated and all of that. But then if you look at the technical aspects of drilling out a large copper porphyry and the cost and the time and the amount of drilling and the amount of modeling, and then trying to work out what the best sequence to develop it is, you're talking several years of studies before you even come to a conclusion of what the best way to develop the most financially optimum and risk-adjusted way to develop these projects is a very complicated project. Very complicated process.
I perhaps naively, but when I kind of running exploration programs on copper porphyries, there's always the attractiveness that with a very small number of drill holes, because you can get very continuous mineralization, which is both laterally continuous and kind of vertically continuous, you've got the potential to drill out a significant tonnage with a very small meterage. So in some ways, your first steps can be really, really quick, much quicker than they can be on a highly nuggety variable gold deposit, which needs close-spaced drilling. You can put a block of mineralization together really, really quickly, but that's not the whole story, is it?
No, and I think if you can paint a picture of what may or may not happen between those drill holes, and you get some great lateral or vertical continuity. But the devil is always in terms of coming back in and drilling on tighter spacing. Now, there's less variability at porphyry, but what we know of geology is there's always going to be variability, and it's that variability that is a killer when you get into production. If you don't understand it, it can really cause problems. It can work in your favor, but it seems to rarely work in your favor. It almost always seems to work against you. Those unknown unknowns.
I remember a couple of times when it has worked in their favor. I remember Rangold with Marilla when they were started ramping up. They were getting more gold than they expected. They had underestimated the grade, although that did create a problem because there was gold going to the tailings, which was a kind of a lost bit of a kind of economic opportunity. But it was still a relatively nice problem to have.
Yep. It's management when it goes in your favor, and it's geological problems when it goes against.
Let's talk about kind of the detail of kind of timeline planning and kind of how you think about staging, and because you've gone from a PEA and you're going straight to a feasibility study. That presumably, we've spoken about it on a kind of a Marimaca special kind of or separate conversation, but it's about trying to condense that timeline to production.
Yeah, we did an internal pre-feasibility study. So typically the way it works is PEA is about a concept. Okay, conceptually, should we spend any more money on this project? Should we continue to invest? Shall we take it forward by wrapping some high-level economics around it? We did quite a lot more work than just high-level economics, so we went into the detail. But you can do just a sort of back of the envelope, okay, should we be spending more money? The pre-feasibility study is about trade-offs. Okay, are we developing this the right way? Should we be thinking about this in a different way? And for us, the project that we have is relatively simple. It's not a huge sub-level block cave that has, multiple permutations of development that could be put in place in order to optimally develop this. We don't have 25 different potential sites to locate things. We're not thinking about potentially having a plant at the top and, slurry pipeline down to our port facilities. We don't have to identify port facilities and all of that. So it's a much simpler project. So we did an internal, what we call the PFS trade-off, which kind of addressed all of those areas of uncertainty for us. And so you're right, we'll then go into a feasibility study. I think it's an important step for a bigger project. You have to go through that pre-feasibility study to really go, okay, well, is this better than that? And come to an economic and sort of risk management view on the optimum way to develop the project. So that's where you start to see a lot of time and money being spent is on those trade-offs. You can spend a lot of time analysing which is the best way to develop it.
And I guess that decision becomes more critical the more marginal the project, because tiny variations in your setup and your approach and your scheduling and your timing can affect the economic viability of a project. But if you've got a greater margin, we were speaking about this last time, the capex of an oxide project is very different to the capex profile of a sulfide operation, and so that gives you a degree of flexibility. So getting obviously you want to get the right format and the right schedule, but getting it absolutely to the kind of precision engineering to the millimeter is less critical for an oxide than it is for a higher margin project than it is for a more marginal project.
Yeah, and I think if you're less driven by return on invested capital, if you're a single standalone company that's your only asset, you're going to be a lot more focused on controlling the capex and therefore right-sizing the project. Whereas an Anglo-American, a BHP, a Rio might say, well, we're getting 10% return on our money, but in 25 years' time, we'll be operating wise, and so we're less concerned about whether or not we spend that capital up front, because we're thinking about this being a 75 or 100-year mine. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. There are a lot of things that drive decision-making depending on your position as a company and what you're trying to achieve and what you're able to achieve in terms of raising money. So it is a relatively challenging process you go through in that de-risking process.
That's a really interesting point. Thank you. So you're saying that a major might look at your project completely different to a kind of a medium development company, because they're not balance sheet constrained. They're more driven on product. Is that what they're trying to do? Is they're trying to just make sure that they've got a kind of or return of capital long term?
I think they're trying to find something that is meaningful for them as a company in terms of scale. So they don't want to start with something small and then have to ramp it up unless they don't understand the commodity. But if it's a copper project, they want to have a couple of 100,000 tonnes a year of production, something that's going to move the needle. And so they're going to take a view that actually we should invest the bigger money up front, even though that might not be the optimum return on invested capital profile. For them, having it right-sized from the beginning and might be the best decision for them. And they, sometimes have different views on how so they may view all of the money that's been spent on drilling, some of the construction costs, some of the pre-strip mining. That might be just sunk capital, and so then they can justify the future investment on only the next dollars being spent. So there's a lot of difference in strategic thinking about allocation of capital at a major company as there is compared to a company of ours.
And that typically means a longer timeline, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the majors' timelines to develop a project is significantly longer than a smaller mid-sized company. I mean, if you look at a group like Ivanhoe, which is now in the major category, but if you look at the way they approach mine development, it's very, very different to how the majors would do it. I think one of the best examples would be Fortescue Mining. There's an example of a group that broke all records in developing iron ore mines in Australia. Very, very different approach, taking a lot more risk on than the majors would be willing to. And again, your appetite for taking on some risk will impact your timelines, and majors typically don't like risk. They like to cover off everything down to the letter. Whereas other groups, you'd referenced Randgold, they've done it very successfully. The other group that takes really good risk-adjusted decisions is B2 Gold, who I'm quite familiar with. They're exceptional at developing. In copper, First Quantum is absolutely world-class, and they take risk-adjusted decisions on the fly to adjust the timelines of their projects. Now, that takes a lot of skill and a lot of experience to do that. It can be very, very risky if you take that approach without the right skill set.
And then you come back to the Lundin Group with kind of no guts, no glory. And it's, you take the risks. And what's extraordinary is that when it's done with as you say, experience and technical expertise, then the rewards are phenomenal. And if you look now, Fortescue and First Quantum are both majors, and their cash flow profiles are just ridiculous. I mean, they're dominantly kind of powerful cash generating machines. It's really extraordinary. So when it comes to thinking about timelines of copper projects, we're in this funny mix, aren't we? Because there's not a huge amount of available capital. It's difficult in some ways to get the mid-tier and the juniors financed. The majors, as you've just described, are slow and cautious and conservative. The discovery rates for new projects, notwithstanding the Vicuña district done in by the Lundins, is still pretty low. So presumably this all feeds into the kind of the general supply demand thesis that supply is going to continue to be constrained on an ongoing basis.
Absolutely. I think that's the biggest driver of this constrained supply thesis. Not forever, but certainly for the next, in my view, decade, which is why, I think I've said previously on the show with Matt, I have never been more bullish a commodity than I am copper because of that, because of the demand profile that is growing and has to grow if we're truly going to electrify. And we've got all these ambitious targets which cannot be achieved, even if the mining industry is completely successful, they cannot be achieved. And so the only way it happens is if the copper price goes up quite significantly. And it encourages, there are lots of projects around, but they need a higher incentive price to get into production. But even if we get that pricing, it's going to take years for the supply to catch up, in lieu of, Kamoa tripling its production and filling that gap, which it may do. I think the next 5 to 10 years in this space is going to be really, really positive as a result of all of those things we've discussed.
One of my pet topics is supply elasticity or supply inelasticity. When I look at lithium or graphite or indeed nickel, if there's a price rise, there's an ability to ramp up production. These are very, particularly graphite and lithium, they're very immature industries. There's plenty of rock which is there to be developed, but copper is supply inelastic. It's been a lot of the good stuff has been mined, and these timelines, the price rises, you won't get that supply response in the same scale or the same level or same proportion that you would for lithium or graphite. I mean, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it depends on how quickly the prices increase, but I think there will be a lag. I think there is the ability for brownfields expansion and more copper to be developed or more copper to be produced from existing assets for a period of time, which should have quicker timelines of production than say a new greenfields development. But I think certainly there is a time lag. But even if the copper price accelerates, there's time lag. And every month that goes by that these big projects that are owned by groups like First Quantum are not being green-lighted, it means the whipsaw at the end, in my view, is going to be more aggressive. I think there's a period where the copper price just goes vertical and stays relatively high until all of these new projects are incentivized to come on. And then we may see a trade-off, hence the bullishness on the copper over the next 5 to 10 years.
Whoop, whoop. We're kind of bullish copper. No surprise there. Just to wrap up, what's your timeline on production at Marimaca?
Well, the main driver of our timeline to production is our permitting. No surprise there. It's our critical path. Everything else is a relatively short time frame, but we can't start construction until the permits are in. So with the new investment from Mitsubishi, we're kicking off all of the work to submit our permit application by the first quarter of next year. That's a pretty aggressive timeline, but we think it's achievable now that we've got those funds in. We'll do the DFS in parallel, the bankable finance feasibility study in parallel with that, with a goal that it will be delivered sometime around Q3 of next year. And then immediately following that, we're deep into financing. Based on those timelines, we think we can be in construction early 2025. And that will give us first production. Well, it's a slightly less than 18 months to build it. First production after that, commercial, fully ramped up production, let's call it 2 years. So we're sort of late 2026, early 2027. There is really nothing else in the copper space that can be in production in that timeline. I think that's a large reason why Mitsubishi is very interested in us, because the cupboards are bare for new copper supply. And so, we're pretty excited about that. And actually, I think, Sergio discovered this in 2016. That would be nearly 10 years from discovery to first production. I think we'd be breaking all records if we achieved that. That's the goal. We want to set a precedent on how to move the project forward. Obviously, there's a benefit in that we have a much smaller and simpler project to move forward. So that's the goal. Let's see if we can execute.
Well, good luck. And Hayden, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you about this.
Thanks, Carl.